So this next conversation is on perspectives on the future of local journalism, kind of kicking off from the current state of play that we were hearing about in the previous discussion. And so this panel really try to consider what a public media system that's truly public may look like, how that relates to local journalism and organizing in newsrooms, democratizing community infrastructure, creating media institutions that are owned and controlled by journalists and local communities. So by way of introduction, I'm Bryan Mercer. I'm Executive Director at the Media Mobilizing Project and an affiliate with the Mike Center. Media Mobilizing Project's work has really been about incubating and growing local movement organizing as a hub for communications, for strategy, for coordinated action around issues of inequality, mass incarceration, media rights and access. And I want to provide a brief intro of this really rock star panel that we have here. Some people that I've been able to work with over recent years, and some people who I'm meeting for the first time and really excited to share this space with. Before I introduce the panel, though, I really want to thank Victor and Todd for the work of creating the Mike Center. Todd is a co-founder of the organization I now direct and help to lead. And you know, I think the beautiful thing about that founding vision was really understanding that present moment back in 2005 and beginning to project from that moment into what the future may look like. The rapid change that was spurred by technology innovations and the internet in that moment, the challenges and increased isolation and fragmentation experienced by communities, and the potential for some of those same technologies to offer an opportunity for working class communities to really forge new ties, new alliances, and new strategies for organizing. And now nearly 15 years since that, we've seen some of that promise come to pass in national and global social movements. And we're understanding new challenges that are really embedded in technology in this moment of racial monopoly capitalism. So for our work in Philly, really it's been about building up local and engaged organizing with communities that puts communications and communication strategy at the center of work that does coalition and alignment building across various movement forces. And so as a part of that work, we've been really excited recently to be working with the Mike Center as a partner to tackle some of these questions in the context of Philadelphia City Council races. For anyone following local politics, the Philly City Council races can really feel like a circus at times. And working with Mike Center, actually, we're starting to change some of the dialogue between community organizers and journalists, really recognizing that the stories that are being told about the election, the priorities that are being represented, the issues that are being reported on are going to have an impact on the political outcome and future for the next 4 years for our town. And I think the Shared Stories project that Todd and Breyer and Mark have been working on is a great example of some of the types of interventions the Mike Center is really set to make. And so, yeah, to introduce our panel, who's going to get into some really important insights into where this future might go. First, we have Christopher Ali. Chris is an assistant professor in the Department of Media Studies. His research interests focus on communications policy and regulation, critical political economy, critical geography, comparative media systems. His new book, Media Localism, The Policy of Place, addresses the difficulties of defining and regulating local media in the 21st century in the US, United Kingdom, and Canada. Then next we'll have Craig Aaron. Craig has led Free Press and the Free Press Action Fund since 2011. For more than a decade, he's been a leader in major campaigns to safeguard net neutrality, stop media consolidation, oppose unchecked surveillance, and defend public media and sustain local journalism. We're also joined by Sarah Jaffe. Sarah is the author of Necessary Trouble, Americans in Revolt, which Robin D.G. Kelley called the most compelling social and political portrait in our age. Sarah's staff writer in these times and labor editor at Alternet. She was also one of the first reporters to cover the Occupy Wall Street movement and the Fight for 15. And then rounding out the panel, we'll have Jean Freedman Rudovsky. Jean is a Philadelphia native. She's passionate about journalism's role in creating a fair and just society. And she's the founder of Resolve Philadelphia, which has been working on sustained collaborative and solutions-oriented reporting. And in 2017, Resolve worked on an amazing project, the Reentry Project, covering returning citizens, and is now working on the Broken Philly Project, covering inequality and poverty in the city. And so we'll give each of our panelists about 12 minutes to share their own thoughts and remarks, and then we'll have some space for a conversation after. And Chris, could you start off?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to Victor and Todd for the invitation to speak today. It's very humbling to be on this panel, and always nice to come home again, although the pressure's always on, you know, when one speaks at their alma mater. So if I had to give kind of my 12 minutes a title, I would say the title is The Future of Local News from Newspapers to Broadband. And what I want to try and do is connect the trajectory of some of my research projects, so from thinking about media localism to the future of small town newspapers, and most recently to rural broadband. And what I want to argue is that the future of local communication is not only about content, but it's about infrastructure. Specifically, it's about broadband. And I want to focus specifically on rural broadband. And the solution to these larger structural problems that we heard about in our last panel, we're hearing about today, and within local communication revolves around the hard work of communities and localities themselves. So to get us here, I want to start with local newspapers, small market newspapers, and work my way to the digital. So from 2016 to 2018, Damian Radcliffe, who's a professor at the University of Oregon, and I embarked on a project to understand the state of small town newspapers. We did so because we felt that in the annals of local newspapers and scholarship, we tended to focus exclusively on the major metro papers, you know, the New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, the Rocky Mountain News, and our very own Philadelphia Inquirer. And not the thousands of titles that make up the bulk of the American ecosystem, the newspaper ecosystem. So consider this. There are currently 7,071 daily and weekly newspapers published in the United States. 6,851 of those, or a full 97%, fall into the category of what we consider to be small market newspapers. And these are those with a circulation of under 50,000. So this is not some missing middle, but rather a silent majority of stories that have yet to be told. And we wanted to tell these stories with a particular focus on their adoption of digital technologies. What we found was an ecosystem that was actually faring better than their larger metro counterparts, and an ecosystem that was optimistic about the future. So this obviously conflicts with the doom and gloom narrative that we've been hearing about the newspaper industry. And I don't want to denigrate the very real material challenges facing newspapers. Penelope Abernathy at UNC, for instance, found that since 2004, 1,800 newspapers have closed. Well, of course, the Pew Foundation estimates that newsroom employment has fallen by 23%, or 88,000 jobs, from 2008 to 2018. These are very real and material concerns and deserve our attention. Nonetheless, our study of small market newspapers contradicted or at least qualified some of these scary numbers. And we identified a couple of reasons for a sense of optimism among small town newspapers. So for instance, people still read and pay for rural newspapers, right? They're often the only news voice in a town, oftentimes the only news voice in a county, which means that for the time being, they have a monopoly. There's also the daily weekly model that they use. Many of our interviewees came from weekly publications, and for them, being weekly can be an editorial asset, allowing them to take a step back and tell the news in a more comprehensive manner than found in the more throwaway environment of the 24/7 news cycle. There's also the issue of reputation and heritage. Small-town newspapers have been able to capitalize on their longevity and incumbency, something that means a lot in the age of digital fly-by-night startups. There's a trust embedded here that should not be discounted. And of course, as we know, Americans trust local news more than they trust any other type of news. And lastly, small-town newspapers move at a different pace, right? The experience for many metro dailies or national newspapers is different, with digital platforms and competing advertising channels more discernibly reducing advertising revenue. Reduced competitive demands have allowed small market newspapers to adapt and learn from their larger peers at a different pace. So let's reflect on this last element for a second. Small market newspapers have been able to learn from the failures and successes of their larger peers. And one particular example of this is in digital adoption. In a nationwide survey of small market newspapers, my team inquired into their digital habits. The newspaper industry is often criticized for its slow-paced digital adoption. This is evident in everything from distribution to production practices to new approaches to reporting and storytelling. The narrative suggests that digital adoption is a zero-sum game, right? Papers either adopt or fail to adopt, and that slowness is an obstacle to profitability. The digital life of small market newspapers adds nuance to this argument and at times actually departs from it. That these papers move at a slower pace in adopting digital technology should not be taken as a refusal of the digital, but rather as a deliberate reaction to market forces, resource allocation, and best practice sharing. So for instance, at the small market level, most newspapers are still reliant on their print product. While metro and national newspapers are focusing on digital and gaining digital subscribers, many small market newspapers are yet to make this leap, suggesting that a digital-first strategy may not be an appropriate mantra just yet, because their audiences, their advertisers, and their newsroom are not ready for this transition. Still, we found a sector eager to learn about digital tools. Video and live video were prominent among small market newspapers, while a handful made use of podcasts. A number of survey respondents also expressed high levels of interest in learning about video reporting, live video, and podcast. But in contrast, they're probably less interested in learning about chat apps, augmented reality, and virtual reality. From a political economic standpoint, ownership has a lot to do with this. While digital experimentation is not confined to ownership type, we need to be sensitive to the fact that small market newspapers face a very real challenge. Either sell to a larger chain like Gannett, if they haven't already, or try to go it alone. Already, New Media and Gatehouse own about 451 newspapers, Gannett owns 216, and Digital First Media owns 158. To its credit, chain ownership brings with it expertise and digital sophistication. But local ownership brings that which cannot be achieved by a chain, localism. Abernathy calls these ghost newspapers because they are shells of their former selves when they sell to a larger chain. Small market newspapers tend to exist, believe it or not, in small towns, right? And small towns exist in rural America. Rural America, meanwhile, has brutal broadband access. And this is where we can start to think through where the digital and the journalistic collide, and that is with the issue of broadband. The FCC found that 30% of rural Americans, or 19 million people, lack access to broadband speeds. But that's just the beginning. Our broadband maps and data, for lack of a better word, suck. Microsoft actually predicts that upwards of 162 million Americans, right, that's half, do not access the internet at broadband speeds. For journalism, this is a gut punch. None of the experiments that I mentioned with podcasting, augmented reality, virtual reality, can take place without a high-speed broadband connection. More specifically, none of these projects can take place without what is called symmetrical broadband. This means that download speeds and upload speeds are the same. Right now, we define broadband as 25 megabits per second download and 3 megabits per second upload. And this privileges the consumer much more than the producer. As was explained to me, download is for consumption, upload is for production. Sure, we can stream content on Netflix, but we can't upload content to YouTube. For the rural newspaper or the inner city news startup, they cannot upload their latest podcast or attempt at AR in real time because of the delays in upload. Nick Matthews, a PhD student at the University of Minnesota, finds that the lack of broadband significantly impacts news consumers in small rural communities, especially when the newspaper closes and where Facebook is not trusted. There's a parallel then between the challenges faced by local news and the digital divide. Like larger newspaper chains, the incumbent telecommunications companies have all but ignored rural America. If they happen to be the service provider, they refuse to upgrade their lines from copper to fiber and refuse to commit to customer service. Just as we have ghost papers with large chains, rural America is haunted by the specter of large telecommunication companies. Where large ISPs don't provide service, we end up with broadband deserts, not unlike what Penelope Abernathy calls news deserts, areas devoid of fresh local news, or what I call farm-fresh broadband. Another parallel also exists, however, and this is exciting, is the parallel of optimism. The optimism of small market newspapers is mirrored in the power of communities coming together to solve the digital divide. This takes place in the form of electrical or telephone cooperatives deciding to offer fiber optic broadband connectivity, or in a municipality deciding to fund broadband itself. This is called municipal broadband, and such was the case in Rockbridge County, Virginia, home of William and Lee University, and Lexington, Virginia. Lexington, Virginia is of course famous for housing the restaurant that kicked Sarah Huckabee Sanders out, just to give a little context here. So the Rockbridge Area Network Authority was formed as a partnership between the university, the cities of Lexington and Buena Vista, and BARC, the local electrical cooperative. Together, they brought fiber to this county of 22,000 residents. One of the first businesses to sign up for fiber? The newspaper, right? Communities are coming together to solve their broadband problems, and rural newspapers are continuing to survive despite an unforgiving political economic climate. So while we can't assign any form of causality here, the common thread is the concept of localism. Local news thrives best when it's under local control and has a strong local presence. Similarly, if I may be so bold to argue, all broadband is fundamentally local. It will be the local communities and co-ops that solve the digital divide, and not AT&T, CenturyLink, or whatever emerges from the T-Mobile Sprint merger. So what can we do? Aside from a direct transfer of wealth from tech companies to journalism, which Emily Bell of the Tao Center strongly recommends and I full-heartedly agree with, there's a couple of ways in which broadband can materially benefit local journalism. The first is the spectrum auction. And here I'll point to the amazing work done by Free Press News Voices, where the sale of spectrum from broadcasters to telecommunications companies netted the state of New Jersey over $300 million. Free Press succeeded in having $5 million of that earmarked for a local news fund. The second is franchise fees. Right now, there's a debate going on about 5G connectivity and something called small cells. So first off, despite what we might be hearing from the big telecommunications companies, 5G will not be coming to rural America anytime soon, right? But when it does, we need to maintain local control of small cell distribution. Small cells, by the way, are these little like pizza-sized boxes that are going to have to fit on every single telephone pole in order to enable 5G connectivity. Franchise fees are fees that a telecommunications company or a cable company pays to a community for video. And these should be applied to small cells right of way. These fees could be a boon for local news, especially that produced on public access television. The third is municipal broadband, empowering communities like Lexington or Laverne, Minnesota, or Garfield County, Washington, to come together to tackle their own broadband deserts, and in doing so, take their futures into their own hands. So, if there's something to take home from this, is that the future, my friends, is local, be it in news, communication, or democracy. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Chris. Craig?
Slides.
Your slides are there?
Craig has slides.
Maybe.
Maybe your slides are
Or
there.
group 2, probably.
I'll show you.
Here we go. Yep. I think I got it. And This is cool. Power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts, absolutely. Just bear with me while I find the play button. It should be super. All right, here we go. Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm really honored to be part of this panel and the launch of this great institution. Victor and Todd have been incredible allies of mine for a long time and colleagues, and I just can't wait to see what they can accomplish here and all the new opportunities to collaborate. I'm also just really excited to be in Philadelphia because Philly is kind of where it's all happening right now. And a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about really builds on and rests on the shoulders of incredible local activism that's happened here in Philly. At places like Media Mobilizing Project, Prometheus Radio Project, the people that put together Philly Cam. I mean, this has really reshaped how I think about doing this work from a national level and what it really means to organize. We have to mobilize too, but there's some key organizing work that's happening here that's been really inspiring. So glad to be able to talk about some of it. I'm Craig Aaron. I'm the president and CEO of Free Press. And for those of you who don't know Free Press, we're a national nonprofit advocacy organization that works to change media and technology, to transform democracy, to realize a just society. And over the past 15 years, of course, I put a giant picture of myself in this presentation. I'm not sure why. We've been advocating, and Barbara Lee, we've been advocating inside and mobilizing outside Washington on issues like media consolidation. I do have a lot to say about the plight of Rupert Murdoch, but I'll save that for later. Net neutrality, winning net neutrality, which we're really starting to do, taking it back, surveillance, corporate accountability, and the future of journalism. And I was interested in the framing of this panel as we talk about public media, because that's something I've fought for and sometimes against a lot over the last 15 years. And you know, I'm someone who has definitely stood in front of the US Capitol chanting, "Whose streets? Sesame Street!" And really, and so I have a lot of love for public media, but I found that, you know, often when we'd fight to defend, you know, the funds that were being cut and taken away 17 or 70 times that we did that, and we'd be so excited, and then we'd go in and be like, all right, we won. Now let's talk about like deep reforms and building the system we need. And we would just kind of get like a pat on the head and ushered out the door. People were glad to have the support in maintaining the status quo, but the deeper structural changes were too much. And so I think we've got policy problems, we've got organizing problems that need to be solved. And I think if there's any hope of a truly public media system, to borrow from the panel description, it's going to start with changing the relationship between newsrooms and the communities that they're supposed to serve. I think that's going to mean rebuilding locally from the ground up. It's going to require a culture change inside and outside of the newsroom. And it's going to require an organizing strategy that really does mobilize people as constituents, not just consumers, to change the structures to actually get us the news we need to build stronger communities and maybe even a functioning democracy. And that's the kind of work that we're trying to seed with a project we've been working on for the past 4 years called News Voices. And in 2015, we launched News Voices in the state of New Jersey. And I want to acknowledge, as we do all this work, my colleague Mike Rispoli, who's sitting here in the crowd, who leads that project and whose work I'm going to take credit for right now. We started holding public forums across the state where we invited newsrooms and local residents to come together and sit across the table from each other. Not all the journalists on the stage, not all the public officials talking, but actually having a dialogue and a conversation to start to build relationships and to talk about the future of local news. And for reporters, this meant a whole bunch of news sources who didn't necessarily put out press releases or stand behind podiums. For local residents, it fostered a different kind of understanding of what the job of a journalist is. That journalists need to tell stories, they don't get to tell issues. and it requires a different kind of approach. And these conversations sparked more conversations and have inspired a bunch of experiments that are designed to reshape the relationship between newsrooms and communities. Just a couple of examples. In New Brunswick, with students at Rutgers and a New Jersey arts organization, we've been collaborating on the 37 Voices Project, which presents sort of untold stories of the working poor through journalism, through oral history, and soon through a play, a theatrical production, building on the reporting that the students did. In Camden, we collaborated with a group called IREX, like an international group that had developed a sort of an anti-propaganda training in Ukraine to fight Russian propaganda, and we brought it to New Jersey, not to fight Russian propaganda, although, may become relevant, but to talk about misinformation in the community. In Atlantic City, we've seeded a project really 3 years after we first went and had a public conversation. Now a group has come together, including folks from Montclair State, and a lot of local Atlantic City folks, on a project built around restorative narrative, a project to talk about the assets that are in that community and tell a fuller story of the city. In Newark, we're about to launch a project. I'm not sure it's public yet, but now it's public. We're going to be embedding an organizer inside the newsroom at WBGO, the public radio station in Newark. Is actually going to be working in the newsroom and working to build connections to the community in collaboration with our team. We took what we learned in New Jersey, and we've expanded it to the state of North Carolina, where we have another News Voices project. And in particular, we've been working with the Charlotte Observer on a series of small group meetings organized by my colleague Alicia Bell there, that have been meeting with local residents, first in a small confidential group, and now they've taken it out across the city in unusual places that we're not normally talking about issues. Well, there's a lot of talk about issues like gentrification and immigration, but we're having these conversations in libraries and community centers, in a barber shop, to actually talk about news and how it's covered. And we've seen already changes in how the establishment mainstream journalism is approaching communities and telling these stories. And then this spring, we've been running a little experiment here in Philadelphia with our allies at the Germantown Info Hub and Kensington Voice and the People's Education Center and WHYY to talk about organizing for neighborhood news, a pilot project to bring together, again, organizers and journalists and talk about changing that relationship here in Philadelphia. So it's a lot of different experiments and things that are out there, all designed to figure out what works, what scales, what's worth trying out in other places. And this has sort of led to we've learned a few things, hopefully, and things that we're trying to do. One is really trying to shift to center community a lot more in the conversations and debate over the future of journalism. We definitely need to talk about business models, but we're interested in how we spend less time on paywalls and what I'm learning are increasingly meaningless metrics, more time on community needs. Everywhere we go, every community we enter, there is a deep hunger for trustworthy local news and information. Now, local residents don't necessarily seeing themselves as having a stake in like the journalism industry, which is so often how our debates are framed, but they do really care about how communities get information and how their stories are being told. And in some ways, this starts with the need to recognize and redress the reality that the good old days for journalism just weren't that good for most people. They weren't that good for most communities. And it's been crucial in this work to prioritize engagement and outreach to communities of color, to low-income and immigrant communities that the media haven't served. And that focus on racial justice, on racial equity is something we've built, we've centered in this project because that's where the answers are going to come from. They're not going to come from the old media. They're not going to come from Silicon Valley. We've got to do it in community. Part of what we've been trying to do is really get journalists to think more like organizers. Too often when you go into a community, they talk about how the only time they ever hear from reporters is when they want something They want a quote. They want a reaction to a tragic event. And this has been defined as the job of reporters. Be the one to go up and ask the hard questions in the midst of the absolute worst days of people's lives. But this relationship has become so transactional, so extractive, and it's a huge barrier to communities actually trusting journalists and journalism. So we believe that journalists have a lot to learn from organizers and that they can benefit from shifting that traditional newsroom culture from purely transactional relationships to ones that prioritize deep listening and collaboration and actually build relationships that are rooted in community. We also believe that one of the priorities is how do we open the door to new models? If we're going to disrupt this death spiral in local journalism, we've got to create some space for new approaches. The old days aren't coming back, and the old ways didn't serve us very well. And I think through all the cutbacks and clickbait and demands for more collusion and consolidation, newsrooms only got more disconnected from the communities that they were supposed to serve. And so I think we really need to be learning and building from the alternatives that are beginning to emerge. This definitely includes Broken Philly. I would look at Outlier Media in Detroit, El Timpano in Oakland, which is pictured here. This giant thing is a listening post set up for folks in immigrant Latinx neighborhoods to come and just tell their story, react to some questions, just as a way to change how things are showing up. That's a really cool project. The City Bureau in Chicago is an incredible local thing where they're training community members to be documenters, training community folks to go out and fill in those gaps where reporters aren't covering the zoning meetings and the school board meetings and the city council meetings like they used to. And this is not limited to new and upstart projects. Like our mainstream media friends can embrace new approaches too. I'm really encouraged, for example, about what the response we've gotten from like WHYY here in Philadelphia in a willingness to have different kinds of conversations, and we need more of all of this. We've also got to figure out what are the new creative policy approaches. We have this question underlying all this: how are we going to pay for it? And I've got some ideas. My colleague Tim Carr and I recently proposed a tax on targeted online advertising. Des was kind of referring to the British version of this approach earlier. And we think if we targeted tax on online advertising, we could create billions of dollars in support for new and local journalism. We kind of think of it like a carbon tax, which is imposed in many places, right, to get the oil industry to clean up pollution, help clean up pollution. We think it's time we start taxing to help clean up how the platforms are really polluting our civic discourse. They're massively profitable, they're building on this model, and it's often being used to spread lies and propaganda. If serious journalism is one of the antidotes to that problem, we're in trouble because serious journalism is facing this existential crisis. And we know that the production of this kind of journalism isn't a public good. It has tremendous democratic and economic benefits. And our proposal is sort of this is one way to start righting the imbalance. We think a 2% tax on all online enterprises earning more than $200 million a year in annual digital ad revenues would yield more than $1.8 billion that could be spent on journalism and local projects. So that's about roughly 4 times what the current budget of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting is. There's like a lot of different ways to slice this, a lot of different ways to distribute that money. We happen to like the idea of creating something new, a public interest media endowment to hand out grants, to push the money out of Washington to the local level and support a range of news and information projects. Could be local news startups, could be investigative endeavors, civic and technology initiatives. I want to be the first to acknowledge that even this idea, even a few $1 billion, is not going to solve all of journalism's problems. There's a lot of questions about how would we actually distribute the money, who would get to make those decisions. And there's a lot of questions about, even if we could create all this new content, how would it find an audience? But the bottom line is it couldn't solve all of journalism's problems, but it could make a dent. And it's something we could actually pass. I mentioned that internationally we're doing a lot of that. I didn't even talk about the Civic Info Bill. I'll be really quick. I'm going to do 1 minute on the Civic Info Bill. We can also do this at the state level. We've been running this project. Chris mentioned it. The new state of New Jersey got a couple $100 million. We've been pushing them to actually invest it in local journalism. It's been a really cool campaign. We've mobilized a lot of people, and we passed a bill. We created the Civic Information Consortium. It's a group of 5 universities coming together, seeded with $5 million to fund these kinds of local initiatives. The only problem is that the state hasn't given us the money yet. So we're in a fight right now to actually get the money from the governor. That's going on. We can talk more about that if folks want. The bottom line is that this is the first time the state has ever supported journalism like this, and it was just started by, we made this up sitting around a table. A small group of us got together and built a campaign and engaged a lot of people and went all across the state and got them to invest in public media, when for the last 20 years it's only been cut back. So it's very possible to do, and everybody thinks it's impossible until you actually do it. But we believe that, once people know the media isn't just something that happens to them, that they can actually, it's something for them to influence and change and create themselves, that they're willing to fight for it. And that's what we hope to see a lot more of.
Thanks for that, Craig. Sarah, join us.
Hello. I'm going to ask you all, I'm going to start out not just by thanking people, but by apologizing. I'm getting over a cold. I'm really hoping I won't have a coughing fit in the next 10 minutes, but it might happen. And now, thank you so much for having me here. When I heard about this institution that you were building here, I was like, wow, they made a journalism thing for me. It's like, come talk about journalism and the future of work and inequality. And I'm like, this is like what I want to do all day, every day, is talk about all of these things. I am, in fact, a working journalist. I feel like I'm should get like a hi, Sarah, because it is kind of a tragedy, but also it works. I actually went to journalism school here in Philadelphia, across town at Temple, which I don't think has gotten any shout outs today yet, so I'm the first. And I write about labor and social movements. And so I try to do what Naomi was talking about last night, which is show people that there are things they can do about the fact that everything sucks. And when I started out, I was at Temple 2007 to 2009. So, I was kind of there when the economy crashed. And I actually got a job afterwards, which is shocking that I got a job in 2009 in journalism. But it was really hard to get anyone to care about the things I wanted to write about, which were still labor and inequality. And I could write about the economy and what a credit default swap was and why it broke the globe. But I could not pitch a labor story and get it picked up, even at the sort of progressive to left-leading media where I normally work, unless it was tied to national policy. So the first labor story I ever got paid for was also a Philadelphia story. It was about the security guards at the Philadelphia Museum of Art who were unionizing. And I wanted to tell this local story because it was a great story. They had formed an independent union and were fighting for recognition. And I could do this if I could hook it to, some of you will probably remember and want to cry when I mention the Employee Free Choice Act, which was at the time, maybe, Katie's laughing back there, going to get passed through Congress under Obama, but that didn't happen. It was labor law reform, which we can talk about much more later if you want to. And then what happened was that Scott Walker brought forward this plan to take public sector collective bargaining rights away from public sector workers in Wisconsin. And suddenly, tens of thousands of people were showing up at the Wisconsin state capitol and making a hell of a lot of noise. And suddenly people were calling me and emailing me and being like, Sarah, you know things about labor. Quick, explain this to us. And my ability to write about labor has always gone along with the ability of labor to sort of force itself into the public consciousness like this. So, you know, there was Wisconsin, then there was Occupy Wall Street, then there was the Fight for 15, and then now we're in the middle of a teacher strike wave. I wanted to mention the Verizon strike recently, specifically because one of the union's demands around that strike was, in fact, expanding broadband, because the company did not want to expand broadband into rural communities because it doesn't pay very well. And the workers were actually saying, hey, you say you don't have enough work for us to do. We have an idea of what that work could be. You could actually put us to work expanding broadband. This is a like sort of under-discussed element of the Verizon strike, but one of my favorites. So despite, excuse me, despite all of the ongoing attacks on labor, and you know, Scott Walker did succeed in Wisconsin, it is coming back, and it is making itself heard and making itself felt. And one of the places that that is happening, excuse me, is in journalism. So last year, when we got the numbers from the US government on unionization, despite Janus, despite everything, and if you want me to talk about Janus more later, I certainly can, the numbers were actually up a teeny tiny bit, because that's, you know, they have to compensate for the things that are declining somewhere else. And it was among young workers, and it was in media, it was in tech a little bit, but it's really been an impressive wave of unionization that I think the story the other day said we're now up to 30 media companies that have unionized in the last few years. I was working on a story about this for New Labor Forum that is in the upcoming issue that went to press sometime a couple of months ago, and it was like over 20 then. So just in that period of time, it's been more. And this started, it actually started with Truth Out, which is a progressive news site, which was the first all-digital news platform to organize back in 2010. I was an early adopter there when I did work it in these times, which I no longer do. But in 2014, we unionized. But really, it was the Gawker Media story that kind of broke this. This is probably where all of you heard this thing get started, because Gawker's a big deal, right? Gawker is everywhere. A lot of people spend their time reading various Gawker sites, you know, RIP Gawker, but the various properties still exist, and Gawker's basically been reincarnated as Splinter. And also because Gawker did their union drive the way they sort of do everything, which is loudly and in public, and arguing with each other on Twitter and on Slack and in the comments of Gawker articles. And this really actually set a precedent for the way a lot of these media union drives have taken place since. So they move out into public. This sort of way that these campaigns go public these days is usually on Twitter. And everybody will change their Twitter profile picture. Instead of like stickering up at the office, you change your Twitter profile picture to, I support the, you know, the Mike union, the Refinery 29 union, the New Yorker union. And I mentioned the New Yorker because this has been a wave that sort of often gets said as like the digital media organizing wave. But it's actually also organized a bunch of legacy media that was previously non-union, like the Los Angeles Times. And the thing that's happening in these places is that the working conditions, as Caitlin was talking about before, are all becoming more and more similar. So the working conditions at Gawker and the working condition, or I should stop saying Gawker because it doesn't exist anymore technically. The working conditions at Splinter and the working conditions at the New York Times actually aren't as different as they used to be for most people who work there. The working conditions at the New Yorker for a lot of the young staff also includes the same kind of expectations, and they're in fact hiring people who come out of Gawker, like Gia Tolentino, who's an excellent reporter. These working conditions now are driven by metrics. They are driven by personal branding, which Naomi was talking about last night. You are expected to be always on, always performing. I don't actually have a boss, so nobody is really tracking my metrics and beating me over the head with them. But that means I actually have to spend more time personal branding because that's how I get work as a freelancer. So all of this happening in public, on social media, has drawn a lot of attention to these working conditions, to this idea, to this realization that these jobs that are sold to us as sort of dream jobs, right? You have like the coolest job in the world if you work in the media in New York City, and your job is to like, you know, make fun of Andrew Cuomo all day. It's part of my job. It's so easy. You all laugh, you understand. But these jobs are, you know, so you're supposed to be like grateful that you get to do this job, and you're supposed to be really dedicated to it and love your work. And this is the subject of the next book that I'm working on, not just in media, but all over the place, the ways that the labor of love affects us. Because a lot of the places that we're seeing gains in the labor movement, again, are these workplaces that are labors of love in some way or another, whether we're talking about home care and domestic workers, or whether we are talking about journalists, tech workers, video games workers, the rest. So what happens when digital media and legacy media organize? It actually shapes the coverage, because as Matt was mentioning in the previous panel, you know, we often don't think, as he walks back in, we often don't think of ourselves as workers. That part of the left sort of faded a long time ago. But when people begin to be conscious of themselves as workers, they also start to connect with other people as workers. So when you are a journalist who's thinking of yourself as like a little independent personal brand moving through the world and competing with everybody else, and then you realize that organizing your workplace and collaborating with your coworkers and thinking about solidarity and what that looks like, and then you see the other media outlets that are organizing, immediately the response will be, you know, when somebody else goes public, solidarity from the New Yorker Union, solidarity from the New Republic Union, solidarity from the Mike Union, RIP Mike. You know, these unions, I should say, have not solved the problem, and in fact have in some cases incited bosses to just shut things down, like DNA Info and Gothamist. But what you get is you also get a whole staff at a place like Slate, which maybe some of those people academically knew what a right-to-work law was. Most people still think it just bans unions. But now everybody at Slate has an intimate knowledge of what right to work is, because they spent months fighting management trying to insert it in their contract, and they actually took a strike vote over it. That changes how you cover a right to work campaign, like in Missouri when people are fighting to overturn a right to work law. It makes you think more about your relationship to other people as workers. I want to mention, because we were again talking about rural media, the Missoula Independent, which was an alt weekly in Missoula, Montana, that had a really great union campaign going until, once again, the boss closed the paper. But what they were doing is making their case for their union and for their paper to their community as a sort of bargaining for the common good. We want the community on the side of us as workers and our union, because we want to produce good local news that isn't driven by bullshit metrics. It isn't driven by what the boss thinks is important. It's driven by what you, the people of Missoula, Montana, think is important. And the journalists who were organizing there are still working together and doing really interesting projects that I'm looking forward to following up with more. So I'm about to wrap up here. I just wanted to say that I think when we understand ourselves as part of, as Barbara Ehrenreich memorably gave a speech a few years ago, the working class, and we relate to other people as also members of the working class, this has long-standing impacts, not just on how we cover labor campaigns, but how we cover economic issues writ large and how we understand the world we live in as sort of working people, economic actors, people who are the bleeding edge in many cases of the issues of inequality that we're going to keep talking about. So, and I think I was exactly on time. I'm impressed with myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Jean, thanks.
Let's see here. Oops. Okay. Thanks for having me. My name is Jean Freedman Rudovsky. Great work, Todd, Victor, Breyer, everyone who worked really hard to put this together. There's going to be actually a lot of synergy in what I'm talking about, to particularly Craig's presentation, but also Chris's. So how many of you have seen these graphs, the declining news industry, right? The doom and gloom scenario, which is what we in journalism like to, cry about, lament, and, all sort of stemming, whoops, not on my computer, all sort of stemming towards this, right? Flatlining into death. This is the story that we as journalists have been telling ourselves. And, yes, crying about trying to figure out what is the way forward. And sort of like what Craig said, what I want to talk about is actually, I don't think this is such a bad thing. I don't think it's that. If we think about what this golden age of media was, it was a lot of white men in very authoritative voices telling us what we thought we should know. Right? And sometimes they chose the right things. They did great investigative stories. Not to say that all of the journalism in the past has been, not worth it by any means. But that was what it was. To some extent, a little bit white women and then some folks of color, but it was basically white men telling us what they thought we should know. And as Craig said, it didn't serve a lot of our communities very well. And so, not to disparage the great journalists who lost their jobs in sort of the decline of media, I think that this actually creates a ray of sunshine and the ability for lots of really encouraging things to blossom and grow. Because I think sort of born from the ashes, you have not only sort of new startups and new people getting involved in journalism, creating their own thing, but you also have established media organizations willing to try something completely new because the business model has fallen out from under them, right? It's pushed them, it's forced them into a direction to try many different things, kind of spanning the map, which I think, again, is a reason for optimism. Now, I'm going to talk about sort of the rays of hope, but I think it's also important that one of the reasons, what I was just noting, the fact that, larger media outlets, legacy media outlets, and I'm mainly going to be talking about local media when I talk about all of this, part of the reason that they are willing to try something new, and part of the reason actually I think that that we're able to kind of push folks in a good direction is because people are realizing that as advertising dollars are not going to sustain them, that people are willing to pay money for good journalism, right? This matters. Subscription, I don't have the actual data, but I know that in local journalism, subscription and membership models are, increasing through the roof in terms of their percentage of how much they're actually able to sustain local media. And it turns out that the news that people want to pay for is not clickbait. It's not listicles. What actually leads them to subscribe is great accountability reporting. It's solutions journalism. It is journalism that people think actually serves their own needs and their own lives and that of their communities. And so I think that the fact that we, as a public, are going to have to start paying a lot or paying some for our journalism can actually be a good thing because it means that the news companies are paying attention to what we want and what we think because it's good for their bottom line. So in the sort of ashes of this news industry, these are a lot of the big trends that I see kind of coming forward in local media. I think it's becoming more responsive, it's becoming more inclusive, it's becoming more collaborative, it's becoming more rooted in community and engaged, and it is looking largely, or not largely, but there's a trend sort of towards looking at solutions to social problems rather than just the problems themselves. So I'll talk a little bit about the work that I do and sort of hit on some of those points that were in that last slide. But as I talk about it, I think, and the reason I wanted to kind of start with that premise of where we're at today and why I see rays of optimism is because I think the success that we've had here in Philadelphia with Resolve and the projects that we've led is not just because, yes, I think we have good ideas. I think we're doing, good, hard work. But I actually think a lot of it is timing. I think if we had tried to do what we're doing now 5 or 10 years ago, it would not have worked. And so I think that is why you're seeing, places like Outlier Media, City Bureau, all of these sprouts of optimism, as the chair of the Pulitzer Committee recently said, they are coming up because the timing is right. And so I think if there's anything that you kind of leave here with today, from at least what I've said, it's that now is the moment to sort of seize on these opportunities of both, the ability for new people to come into the media space and create new things, and this willingness in legacy and large institutions to change what they're doing because they just have to, because what they did before wasn't working. So Resolve Philadelphia is a small new organization, started about a year ago. What we do is develop and advance journalism based on equity, collaboration, and the elevation of community voices and solutions. So our flagship initiative is something called Broke in Philly. This is what our homepage looked like this morning. It is a collaborative news project amongst over 20 news organizations, all here in Philadelphia, who are doing dedicated, sustained, solutions-oriented journalism on the issues of poverty and economic mobility in the city. It's everyone from NBC and Telemundo and The Inquirer and WHYY to Dos Puntos. We have Emma Restrepo, who is here, a wonderful independent Latina journalist who has a bilingual radio show, and sort of everything in between, right? Billy Penn, the Public School Notebook, other digital first and niche outlets, all kind of coming together to say, this is an issue that matters so much to our community and to our city that we're going to put our competitive tendencies aside, coordinate editorially together to make sure we're doing the best coverage possible. As Bryan noted, it was based on sort of a similar model called the Reentry Project, which is the project we did in 2017. Same approach, but looking at challenges of and solutions to prisoner reentry in Philadelphia. And so there's sort of three cornerstones to what we do. One is the collaboration, which I just talked about. The next is this idea of solutions journalism. And this is, it's a lot of what Sarah's work is. It's what Naomi mentioned last night as sort of the thing that is most lacking in the media narrative today. It is the idea that we as journalists have a responsibility to not just be reporting on what's wrong with the world, but to be reporting on effective responses to critical social problems. The founder of SJN has a fantastic analogy that he uses to sort of describe this. And he said, it's almost like, what if you went to the doctor every single day just to kind of check in? And the only thing that that told you was what was wrong with your body. Told you all of the ways that your body was breaking down, told you the terrible prognosis for, 2 days, 2 months, 2 years out, told you the terrible symptoms that you might have, and then said, all right, now go on your way. Have a great day. That's essentially what the news media does most days to its patient, right, society. And that solutions journalism says, like a doctor, we have a responsibility to talk about methods of prevention, methods of treatment, what's working, what's being tried, because otherwise, how do we expect people to get that information? And so that's kind of the model of solutions journalism. Not every piece on the Broken Philly site or published by our partners around this topic is solutions journalism, because you also need that root understanding of the problem to understand the solutions, but the kind of arc of the project is looking at what works, or just sort of exploring what is being put into play, what are the lessons from failure, that sort of story. The third element that we're really passionate about at Resolve and the media projects that we lead and with Broken Philly is this idea of engaged or community responsive journalism. So one recent example is that, as has already been talked about, there's really important municipal elections happening in Philadelphia this year. So we came together and thought, okay, what can we do as Broken Philly outlets to make sure we're sort of adding value to this conversation? So the idea that we came up with was creating a Broken Philly candidate questionnaire that we would send to every single mayoral and city council candidate for them to answer about questions regarding economic mobility. And rather than us, the journalists, sitting down and saying, okay, what do we from our, position of expertise think should be asked, we put it out to all of our readers and our entire audience. And so we got over 400 questions submitted to us. And then we're sort of paring down, and then several sites are doing sort of voting rounds. So we've put what we think are are sort of the core questions, and then people can vote on them, and they will be put into a questionnaire that we'll send to the candidates, and then have everyone's responses on a separate site that we build out. So that's one example of kind of how we think about the engagement question. I know there's a lot of times when you hear that word engagement in journalism, it reflects a process that happens after a story has come out, right? How do we make sure that this story that we did not kind of go off into the ether and that people are engaging with it, which is important. But if you don't actually have that process on the front end too, and making sure that your reporting is responsive, then it's not actually changing sort of the process and dynamics of how news and information circulates. So I think, to sort of sum up, I think it is a really, really promising time. I mean, I think Craig is right. We're, in a special place in Philadelphia where there's a lot of really great and cool stuff happening, but I think it's happening in the local landscape all over. And I think that in the end, if we work hard and use this like real moment of opportunity to push the journalism and news industry in the direction that we think it should go, it actually could become profitable again, more healthy, and more equitable over time. So, thanks.
Okay, great. So to sum up, broadband is going to be solved locally. Journalists are organizers, and journalists are part of the working class. And the golden age is done, and that's a good thing. So it would be great to hear if there's any comments coming up from these pieces, reflections for this group. Yeah.
Hi, look for all pertinent. And this is mainly for Christopher, but this is for anybody. As a native and survivor of Pennsylvania, I appreciate the research that you're doing, but also as a native and survivor of Pennsylvania, I did want to push back on something that I constantly hear when people bring up media ecosystems. One of the critiques that I have of a lot of work when we say that a media ecosystem is doing well or thriving is that you're not looking at, are they fairly representing all parts of the community? And in rural communities, especially, while they're invisible anyway, people of color in those communities are especially invisible. I'm from a town that is in central Pennsylvania, but it actually is 1/4 of color. But you would not know that if you actually looked at the local media. So I guess my critique would be that while it's important to look at these broadband issues, that we also need some of the solutions-oriented work that's being done by Free Press and Resolve, because in those communities, especially because the media are more stable because you have no competition, that unless that's done, while you may save those outlets, you are just going to merely continue to disenfranchise populations that are historically disenfranchised.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Thank you very much for that. I think this is actually where we can see the benefit of broadband coming into these communities, where, when we look at broadband statistics as well, I mean, people of color are typically get their internet connections from their phones, if at all, which means that they have a very different interaction, very different experience with the internet than someone who's using it from a laptop. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right that when we are looking at kind of the organizational structures of these institutions, we also need to do that deep dive into content to figure out maybe if some of them are worth saving, and if they are, like how can we change it within a community to reflect people of color, to reflect newcomers, for instance. There's certainly not enough work going on about local news and the newcomer communities, and also tribal communities don't have enough work either in broadband or in local news. So I think you're absolutely right to pinpoint these elements of critique to push us further in our research. Thank you.
And I just want to grab onto that for a quick second, which is just to say also when we're looking at those solutions that the digital divide is very racialized, and we see evidence that even when everything else is equal, including income, communities of color are still underrepresented when it comes to broadband. So I think we need to be thinking about that when we look at policy solutions, and it does get back to a lot of these other issues, because we suspect it has a lot to do with sort of generational wealth, credit checks, things like that are getting in the way of people being able to connect, especially to those wired connections. And there's a lot more, I think, to draw out there to look at. The problem being, in many cases, the biggest barrier, when you get really rural, it definitely is access still, but price. It just, the price is just too damn high, and people can't get connected and then get left out.
And the FCC just rolled back its E-rate, or its Lifeline program, which is a major blowback.
Let's go to Katie and then Michael. Yeah.
So this is sort of a question for both Sarah and Jean, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, sort of in this model of more community-engaged journalism, you think about sourcing, and I'll just give a little context. So I've been a labor organizer for over 20 years. I have literally never had a story in the paper about a worker getting fired where like an employer said, yeah, sure, we fired that worker because they were like trying to form a union or organizing for Fair Work Week or paid sick leave or any of those kinds of things. And obviously that is a challenge that all organizers from lots of different kinds of activist bases have, sort of, there's stuff that we know. I have seen this thing happen like countless times in my career, but I cannot get a reporter to like put that into the record. And I'm just curious about how you think about sourcing differently in this kind of community engaged journalism.
Yeah, good question. So I think, with the specific example you gave, I think, some of the kind of traditional standards or ethics or all of that apply in that, if we're going to quote someone, we need we need a direct quote, we need their permission, we need corroboration if it is, something that is damning, whatever the circumstances may be. I don't necessarily think that in engaged journalism that should shift, but what I do think should shift when it comes to sourcing, and this is actually a really great experiment or not necessarily experiment, a thing that the WHYY has been paying a lot of attention to and has been trying, is shifting this mentality. We as journalists, if you read most pieces on any issue, you have the sort of standard templates for the types of people you are putting into different types of sourcing, right? So you have the person with like lived experience talking about their personal experience, then you have someone with, a counteracting view, and then you have the expert that comes in from the outside, again, often white, often male, often highly educated, sort of giving the kind of God's eye view over the entire piece. And so something that WHYY is trying, they did a source audit led by Andrea Wenzel, who is here from Temple University. They did a source audit and found that in all of their stories, literally 80% of the people who were speaking all of the time were white men. And they found, of course, that rate was even higher when you looked at them as sort of the experts. And so it's something that Sandy Clark is trying to do. She's the vice president of news and civic dialogue or civic engagement there, is trying to say we need to reevaluate who we're looking at as experts, and that people with lived experience can be experts too. You don't have to have fancy degrees to kind of be the one, or you as journalists don't necessarily need to go to the people with high degrees to give this kind of overarching view. And so that's the shift that I think is actually really significant and really important in this kind of engaged journalism space, is valuing that lived experience as its own sort of set of expertise.
Yeah. So I want to jump on that and talk about something that I didn't squeeze into my 12 minutes, which is that one of the big demands about unionizing workplaces in news in various ways is around diversity, and it is around, one thing is just like people are literally making demands like this workplace is full of white guys and you need to hire some people who aren't, but it's also that when you have an average starting wage for a New York City job, which requires you to live in a place where the average apartment rents for $2,000 a month, and you're paying people $30,000 a year, who can afford to do that job? Like, when I am what passes for a working class person, my parents owned a small business, I have 2 degrees. In journalism, we have a problem. And so And what that does to sourcing is when you actually have a bunch of people who, as Des was saying, went to Oxford or Cambridge or the US equivalents of such things. Thank you, Penn, I love you, but you know. They tend to look at people who look like them as experts. And when you have people who grew up somewhere else and experience things another way, they tend to think of different people as possibly being experts in their own experience, but also in the world that they live in. And so I think that again, that really matters to have journalists look like the people that they're covering and have journalists see the people that they're covering as people who are just like them. So you don't sort of go into the story and you write the, you know, sad Trump country story about the coal miners that we've seen 8 million versions of this story, right? That you go back and you write your prestige story for the New Yorker or the New York Times Magazine. No offense to either of those places, would publish plenty of great stuff. But again, and you are assuming that your audience is white college educated people, that your readers are white college educated people, that your journalists are white college educated people, and that the people you're writing the story about are not the people you're writing for. And so I think this has a lot to do with the material conditions of the work. I think it's also a set of ways of thinking that we can teach, even in the Ivy League, and I know you guys are planning on doing things like that.
Michael, yeah.
Interesting presentation. I have two questions again for Sarah on unionization. The first is, what's the percentage of the journalistic industry that is unionized, and how do you see that picking up over the next couple of years? And the second is, what are the 2 or 3 issues that these unions have in common over and above working conditions where people happen to be?
Yeah, I wish I knew the number off the top of my head, because, like, you know, the old newspapers that were dying were often heavily unionized to begin with, right? So like your average, you know, big city daily was likely to be union. And so you lost a lot of union jobs and then brought in these sort of new digital places that are very likely to be non-union. So I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. Sorry. The question about sort of, I mean, everything is working conditions, right? But like, there are demands being made, again, about hiring, about coverage, about metrics, about time off, about not having to be on social media all weekend. Things like that like will shape the industry as a whole. And then I don't know if this is what you're asking. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit more and I can answer a little bit better on what kinds of things you're...
On the issue,
yeah.
I understand what you're saying about working conditions.
Right.
Just addressing some of the larger issues facing journalism that we talked about on the first panel.
Yeah.
Do you see cross-cutting efforts among these unions to delve into some of those and actually push in unison for them?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's happening is because, you know, we're in the middle of another wave of layoffs, is that people are thinking about, you know, in their unions, like everywhere else, about how we actually make journalism sustainable. And I don't know that anybody's got like a great, perfect, because nobody's got a great, perfect solution for making the media sustainable, but that is a very specific, you know, experience that a lot of people are having, that, you know, you lose 20% of your staff on a whatever day. And so in making these demands of the workplace, everybody wants to make sure that they're making their workplace, you know, that they want to continue to have a job. So I think that is happening, and I think it is happening because these people are all in basically one of two unions. It's putting them into conversation with one another in interesting ways.
Thanks, Sarah. Let's hear what Hannah and Chindrai have to say, and then we'll let the panelists give just final thoughts because we're Shannon's time. Yeah.
Great. I can try to make this quick, and I came in a little late, so apologies if I missed this. I'm Hannah Sassman. I work with Bryan at Media Mobilizing Project. I'm doing a lot of thinking about algorithms and computers right now for some reason. So I wanted to tie this panel a little bit to the last one and the terrifying presentation from Dr. Petrie all about the gamification of journalism and the metrics that they track, which are mostly focused on sales and views and capitalism. And just, so I guess this is a question for the two journalists on the panel and for Craig, or really for anyone, like, what metrics do you think we should track? Focusing on like the impact of the stories that you tell or you curate or the organizing that you're doing in newsrooms that you think matter to the health of the democratic experiment.
And before you go into that, just Chindrai, share your thought, and then we'll let them.
Well, this was actually something that Matt brought up, which is with some of these media organizations that are unionizing, and I really appreciate the way that you talked about how that also politicizes them and changes how they cover labor. But one issue is, I'm wondering is, will these unions, how will they come down in terms of trying to actually intensify the monopoly of their specific companies? Will they emerge as a force to counter that because it's in the long-term interest of journalism and of their own leverage in the marketplace, right? Or will they say, like, now that we're in on the deal, and I'm specifically thinking about Spotify, but I think it applies to a lot of the other folks.
Cool. And maybe we'll just go down the line.
Sure. Yeah, well, so I'll address the metrics and impact question because it's a great one and it's something that Cassie and I, my co-director, think a lot about. So I think you're right. I think the impact and metrics conversation is fundamentally flawed because you have often these two sort of poles, right? You have the one that Caitlin presented of just sort of like the clicks and how many eyeballs and for how long and how much did they share it, which, you know, is problematic for all of the reasons that she discussed. And then on the opposite side, you have this sort of obsession with when you're talking about the polar opposite impact, does a story spur policy change, right? Which is obviously important, but those things are kind of few and far between. And I think it's very problematic that we only talk about it in these two kind of black and white ways. So what Cassie and I are doing and trying to figure out sort of impact measurement for Broken Philly, which is actually kind of based on a retrospective impact evaluation that we just did for the Reentry Project that's not public yet, but will be soon. We are trying to use the Center for Investigators reporting sort of basis for impact tracking. So it's looking at, you know, micro, macro, and meso change, behavioral change, both within journalists and in society at large. And so I think there are actually a lot of different poles there. You know, did it spur someone to do something different in their job, in their community? And these things are very hard to track, and they take a lot of time, and they take, you know, it's longitudinal interviews. It's not things that you can necessarily measure easily, but it's super important. Heather Bryan, who does a lot of work in the collaborative space, talks about how why can't we measure impact by, was this story useful to your life? Like, in your daily life, was this useful? And can't we come up with some sort of metric that shows us that? So it's not an exact answer in terms of, you know, this is how we can do it, but these are the things that some of us are kind of thinking about in this space and are trying to quantify in a way, because the qualitative stuff is important, but also quantifying it in a way that's kind of demonstrable on a larger scale.
So much. So yeah, I love that answer, and I would also maybe lift up a little bit the work of James Hamilton at Stanford, who I think has done some interesting work thinking about like the value of investigative reporting in terms of money saved to taxpayers, and, you know, and money brought home from congressional members of Congress when they're actually covered to their home districts. I think there's some things like that we should be looking at. On the second question, I'm drawn to the idea that, you know, the possibilities of solidarity are really exciting to me, because I think that, especially actually when we're fighting with the platforms, also to draw back to the previous conversation, like when you go, and some of us in this room have sat through these meetings, a meeting about like platform accountability, there are 49 issues put out on the table because they're touching so many parts of our lives. And when we go often head to head with these companies, it's really easy to split everybody off into these different rooms and try to play them off against each other. You know, here's the room for the civil rights groups, and right-wingers, you're over here, and journalists, like, oh yeah, let's cut a special deal for you. And there's a lot more, and then the platforms and others are just pushing forward with this idea of just like eyeballs money. Yeah. We know what we want, everybody else is split. So I think there are some possibilities there, and I think we have to figure out how to draw that and then draw it back to the first panel, and to kind of sort of answer your question from earlier, Commissioner Copps, back to these questions of media policy. And this is also where I get my Rupert Murdoch hot take, which is, I'm looking at this giant New York Times story about Rupert Murdoch that came out a couple weeks ago, and
it was epic and gossipy and kind of wonderful, and it was just absolutely a story of media policy. Yeah. Every time Rupert Murdoch, who is literally working to destroy Western democracy, is moving into these new markets, it's all about going and getting these media policy favors, some of which are obscure, some of which are small, many of which Commissioner Kopp's tried to fight, sometimes single-handedly, and it is what laid the foundation to do a lot of the destruction, even as the business model's falling apart. So if we can get out in front as these next Murdochs are emerging, and I think the whole purpose of this event, bringing together journalism thinking about work, could be absolutely essential to how we do that. So I think that's where we have to start.
Hi. These are some great questions, and I do not have answers to everything, but I'm going to tell a story. So I just came back from Ohio a couple weeks ago. I went to cover the closing of the Lordstown plant, which some of you have probably heard of. And the union, the United Auto Workers there, back in the 70s, they had some really big dramatic strikes at Lordstown where they were essentially saying, maybe work sucks. And we did not succeed in that, but we'll talk about that more later. And now, and starting in the 70s, really, when, deindustrialization really kicked into high gear in this country, unions started mobilizing to keep their businesses open. So the UAW's response to Lordstown closing right now is basically, please, please, GM, put a new car in this plant so that we can have our jobs back. And no matter how much you concede to GM and no matter how nice you are to GM, they are not going to stop being GM and they are not going to stop being a profit-seeking entity. And that's also true of Gawker Media and The New Yorker and TNR and even, smaller places that also still have to worry about the bottom line. And so the question of what kind of unions we're going to have in journalism is the same question that these unions had to ask themselves back in the 70s, the 60s, the 50s, the 40s, the 30s, so on and so on, which is, do we think that this is a struggle for us to actually control the conditions of our labor and for that to be, as I mentioned, the Missoula Indy, a thing that is of service to the community, or are we just going to be looking out for whether we continue to have a job? And that is the question. I think there is some hope for the latter question because we've seen, these people who are now getting union consciousness are looking at the consequences of unions that just sort of said, we need to go along and keep our jobs. But that's still a very open question. And I think, as Craig mentioned, the platform question is a really useful one, which every single person who works at, every media outlet is being affected by how Facebook and Google affect the news. And then on the metrics question, I hate metrics with a deadly loathing because nothing that I do is quantifiable except eyeballs, and eyeballs, as we've already learned today, thank you, Caitlin, are the worst kind of metric to actually evaluate the usefulness of a story. So I don't know what kind of change can come out of my Lordstown story immediately. I don't expect it to lead to GM reopening the plant. I don't think that it is going to single-handedly lead a bunch of people in the Lordstown area to be able to buy the plant and make solar panels there or whatever, which is one thing that would be cool. I'm just writing a story and I'm trying to write it a little differently than the normal sad plant closure, look at all these sad white men story. And I don't know how you could possibly quantify the importance of doing that. But I feel with my whole heart that's an incredibly important thing to do, even though it was one of the most depressing weeks of the last year of my life. And that's saying something if any of you know what's been going on in my life the last year.
All right, I don't think I'm qualified to answer the union question, but I can talk about metrics again through a story. So we did this nationwide survey of small town journalists and editors, and one of the questions we asked is, do performance metrics influence the way you produce a story? 88% said some of the time, 32% said none of the time, 10%, and these were not exclusive, that's why my numbers don't go to, but 3% said all the time, which is significant. But we also asked in a qualitative kind of question in our survey, what does engagement mean to you? And all this data, by the way, is public. Our back-end data is all public on the Tau Center for Digital Journalism site for anyone who wants to see our raw numbers, so go nuts. But we actually got a lot of pushback on this question of engagement from small town journalists and editors, because what they're telling us is we're already doing this. We've been doing this for 100 years. It's these metro newspapers who have just learned about what it means to talk to their communities. So one person, and forgive me for being vulgar, said engagement is meaningless bullshit. And so I think there's actually something we can learn about engagement from the way that these smaller communities are thinking through engagement. And again, I'm going to go back to my, all news is local sort of thing, which is that they are invested in also practicing solutions journalism. They are invested in seeing change in the community, and they don't see that as anything new. They don't see engagement as anything new, solutions journalism as anything new. They're seeing it as, well, this is what we do because we are invested in our communities. So rather than, looking at what rural communities can learn from kind of the urban counterparts, this is an opportunity where we can look to rural communities and say, like, what are they doing really well? And I think this is something that they are doing really well, is thinking through what does change and impact mean for them, because they can materially see differences in their communities. Sometimes, not all the time. And I'm certainly not, there's certainly problems with it too, but I think this is an opportunity for us to look back to the rural and to small towns.
All right, can we give a hand to this wonderful panel?